Now, there are a lot of crazy stories in Washington state that we could actually discuss today. But for this video, I really want to cover a very underreported story about a corrupt and terrible judge from Kitsap County who was recently removed, or at least recommended to be removed, from office. And I'm talking about Bremerton Municipal Court Judge Tracy Flood, who was just so horrible and abusive in her public capacity as judge. It's frankly quite stunning that it actually took so much work to initiate her removal. But if this was just another story about just another corrupt judge in Washington state, nobody would probably really notice. There's so many of them, unfortunately, that just appear to be terrible. So this is really nothing new by itself overall. But what drew my attention to this judge's case, however, is the clear fact that 7 of our state's 9 Supreme Court justices actually endorsed this judge in her recently successful campaign, and several of them even funded her political campaign with their own contributions. And I mean, these same Supreme Court justices right here, now these guys are going to be deciding to formally remove this judge from office. Will they even do it? And what the heck is actually going on here? I mean, this is just a crazy story, and I think that you really need to hear it. But before we get into the story about how Judge Flood swamped us with a horrific tale of corruption and incompetence, I just want to remind you to hit the like and subscribe buttons that are located down below if you haven't already done so. And also, if you want more people to know the crazy truth about horrific political establishment in Washington state, and unfortunately we have too much of it, feel free to share this video with your friends, family, and neighbors. And if you've ever wondered how such horrific judicial decisions happen in Washington state, well, just let this story be one of many examples for why you can't trust the goofs that we just seem to keep uncovering in these critical positions of power and responsibility in our state. So now back to our Democratic Party's endorsed Judge Flood and her total and complete failure as a judge in Kitsap County. And I mean, listen, this story about Judge Flood started out common enough. She managed to kind of seep her way into a judicial campaign by convincing the progressive activists that she was their champion, and apparently nobody bothered to check with anyone who previously worked for her. In Washington state, we do elect our judges, but the inside kind of dirty game well known in judicial circles is the fact that judges typically resign midterm when they know that they're going to retire. So they do this so that the governor can then just appoint a temporary replacement judge who will serve out that term and then essentially run for office the next election cycle with the benefits of incumbency. And as everybody knows, incumbency is actually a very strong benefit in elections, and the majority of incumbents usually win their political races. Now, the average marginally educated voter, they're just not typically aware of what the judges are and who they are on the ballot. So they essentially conservatively just tend to vote for the one who sounds like that they're already doing the job. I mean, most Washington state judges started out as basically appointees by the governor, which unfortunately means they are typically hyper-partisan activists with insider political pull, and these elections are very rarely contested. Now, judicial elections are rarely contested because the Washington State Bar Association will nearly always just rubber stamp the incumbent, and any attorney who dares to run for judge and then loses will essentially be ending their career, their entire legal career as an attorney, because big firms are often going to fire lawyers who run against incumbent judges, and incumbent judges will often punish lawyers and sometimes their affiliated firms who dare to actually run against their fellow incumbent judges in future legal cases. And this is so that the challenging attorney is never going to be able to prevail in court for their clients ever again. I mean, it's actually kind of a very incestuous club, and you and I are certainly not allowed in it. In fact, in many cases, I've spoken to judicial candidates who receive threatening phone calls directly from sitting judges informing them of the consequences should they dare to proceed to actually challenge a sitting judge. It really is this ugly, unfortunately, and it's actually far worse than I'm representing in this video. The only way you can think about this is just think like an old mob boss kind of movie, and you will kind of sort of understand how the Washington state judiciary currently works. So now we get to enter Attorney Tracy Flood here from Bremerton, Washington, and she's actually run for Kitsap County District Court Judge once back in 2014, and she decisively lost that race. You can see that right here. So ultimately, she shifted to work for the Kitsap Community Resources Board, where, according to a variety of news reports at the time, she generated very negative attention for creating a hostile work environment, failing to do her job, and of course accusing everyone else of being racist, which I'm sure they were. So this was exactly the type of background that the Democratic Party was looking for when the opportunity to run for the Bremerton Municipal Court position kind of came up for election in 2021. And in addition to the local 26 district Democrats funding her campaign, she was also officially endorsed, you can see it here very clearly, by the 7 of the current 9 Supreme Court justices on the Washington State Supreme Court. Now, many of them also wrote her campaign checks to fund her successful political race just a few years ago. Now, please note, she also donated money to the Democratic Party as well at the same time. Now, once she was sworn in as Bremerton's new municipal court judge, this is when the really impactful drama, unfortunately, started to become just impossible to ignore. So keep in mind, a municipal court like the city of Bremerton, in their municipal court system there, they generally handle like misdemeanors and kind of gross misdemeanor cases. I mean, this represents a large number of activities, including things like issuing restraining orders, warrants, quashing warrants, signing commitment hearing documents, etc. I mean, this is actually a perfect entry-level position for new judges because it kind of helps them get acquainted with a lot of critical, kind of busy work that a properly functioning justice system generally needs. However, Judge Flood immediately had a completely disastrous time on the bench in Bremerton, where it appears that she managed to violate pretty much almost every norm of judicial conduct, possibly in just a very short and very comprehensive way. As the pride of the Democratic Party, and with the majority of the sitting Supreme Court justices in Washington State standing right there in lockstep behind her, she just promptly failed at almost every basic task. Now, first, she actually caused every single employee who worked for her to quit and leave. She also inspired another 4 employees that she originally actually hired to replace the entire staff to bail out as well. Now, there were also numerous reports of just a ridiculously hostile and unprofessional work environment, but this was really just the first crack in the dam before Judge Flood inundated the community with her impressive skill set on the bench. According to the recently filed and watered-down 191-page report filed by the Commission on Judicial Conduct about 10 days ago, which I'm actually going to link down below for your casual reading pleasure, it appears that Judge Flood mismanaged court funds frequently, and I'm not sure if any money was completely missing. But this is not a good thing, even if it is common in our government today. According to this same report, actually, Judge Flood directed employees, at least before they quit, to violate contracts and the law at various times. In fact, Judge Flood apparently didn't keep the court docket updated at all, which often it was 3 or 4 weeks behind. So basic stakeholders, this is what they called them, stakeholders, and that means the public, defendants, attorneys, and pretty much everybody who's impacted by the court, they had no idea what was going on, particularly because this judge apparently also mislabeled hearings, and Judge Flood would typically not inform law enforcement of court actions. Important things like quashing warrants or issuing or ending no contact orders or suspending or reinstating driver's licenses, etc. It was just basic competency appeared to be just washed away from the Bremerton court system by Judge Flood. Oh, but unfortunately, it didn't end there. Since Judge Flood was washing out or flushing away most of the staff who actually worked in the court system, she also wasn't even bothering to replace them or even figure out who was supposed to do those missing jobs. So chaos was the order of the day in the flash floods of chaos and tsunamis of confusion that essentially appeared very common under Judge Flood at the time. Now, here's some direct real-world examples of how an incompetent, disastrous judge like this causes great personal harm to the people who actually live there. And one of the specific examples used was Judge Flood's failure to do even basic routine paperwork. And this failure directly led to personal harm. In fact, according to the report, and again, I'll link it down below, but a Henry Daniels, who basically had a competency hearing that was never signed by Judge Flood, and this guy had to remain locked up for an extra 30 days at Western State Mental Hospital for no reason at all, other than just the judge's failure to sign paperwork. And that wasn't the only example in this judicial misconduct report of people spending time in jail they didn't deserve. Other examples include people who had warrants for their arrests, which they had resolved. And so these are people who basically, they just come into the courts, they can fix their outstanding legal problems, so doing the right thing. And then usually this means they pay a fine or some other action. And then when people take this responsibility for their problems, the court essentially quashes the warrant. That's what they call it. And they essentially make it go away. But a judge must sign off on it. Now, Judge Flood apparently couldn't be bothered to actually do this basic task, so people who had resolved their warrants never had their warrants properly quashed because the paperwork just sat there unsigned on the judge's desk for weeks or even longer. And this judicial misconduct report on Judge Flood, it provided the example of an Albert Glover, for example, who had actually resolved his bench warrant, but since Judge Flood refused to do even basic tasks, he was later arrested. His car tires were damaged by spike strips, and he actually served time in jail, which he did not legally deserve at all. Judge Flood also just failed to sign approved warrants for months in one case that was reported in the same report. And defendant Nicholas Braden, whose warrant actually languished for months on Judge Tracy Flood's desk, this guy was released from another jurisdiction, and rather than being taken into protective custody as required by this unsigned warrant sitting on her desk, instead Braden was released from custody and committed suicide. Now, Judge Flood regularly, she never signed or released no contact orders, for example, which meant that people who were concerned about violent threats against them never had the legal protection of a no contact order against their stalkers issued. And that very same judge, Judge Flood here, she would also fail to sign the removal of no contact orders, which would essentially subject other people to unnecessary arrests. And on top of this, Judge Flood routinely botched restitution payments to crime victims. Now, according to this report, up to 5 months this would go on, so the victims would actually have to wait months, many months, for any kind of restitution to come their way, even after the court had it and it was just sitting there. So keep in mind, all these problems were purely because Judge Flood couldn't even bother to do the very basic aspects of her job. She did, however, during this time of staff departures and chaos, she asked for a much bigger budget from the city of Bremerton and, of course, called them racist for not giving her the cash. In fact, it actually appears that Judge Flood typically called everyone who filed complaints against her racist. And I'm sure she was right. I mean, everyone was racist, including the self-identified African-American staff who testified before the Commission on Judicial Misconduct. Now, listen, I don't think that Judge Flood helped herself by trying to delay the judicial misconduct hearing with unsubstantiated health claims and then refusing, I think she said she had cancer, and then just refusing to provide any legitimate documentation to back up her claims, despite many requests by the Commission for this documentation at the time. When you actually read this 191-page report and when you slog through the hearing videos, it becomes very clear that Judge Flood should not have been allowed to manage anyone or anything, let alone be municipal court judge. Now, and listen, and I get it. I mean, people can claim that this is what happens when the voters are not aware of what type of goofball is actually running for this public office. However, despite the clear problems that Judge Flood exhibited well before she ran for this judge seat, somehow she not only received the formal endorsement of the Democratic Party, she also received the specific endorsement of seven, that's the vast majority of our 9 state Supreme Court justices, and several of them even wrote checks to her political campaign. Now, those same judges, these same justices here, they have to officially approve the necessary removal of an obviously incompetent and wholly unqualified judge from public office for the real-world harm here that she inflicted on the community and the people who live in Bremerton for the last several years. Despite the historic and repeated failures of our Washington State Supreme Court justices to actually make honest or even remotely competent decisions themselves, the example of Judge Flood being their preferred choice for lower court positions, it really should make us all go back and then look at the other crazy goofballs that our Supreme Court justices have endorsed and funded throughout our state. I mean, their judgment here is clearly in need of desperate questioning. Now, it seems likely that the Supreme Court will uphold the ruling from the Commission on Judicial Misconduct. It's called conduct, but I call it misconduct in the state of Washington here. I mean, there can't really be another choice. There's just no real excuse here for this type of fiasco and embarrassment to the judicial system anywhere. Despite the role of our Supreme Court justices, and despite the fact that they clearly had on now flooding this disaster of a judge on the people who actually live in the city of Bremerton in the first place. And the city of Bremerton is obviously at risk now for a variety of class action lawsuits against them by the people that are wrongfully imprisoned or otherwise directly harmed by this flood of judicial incompetence. However, the story should go further, and it should incentivize the people of our state, I think, to engage much more aggressively and assertively in these local judicial races. Harmful and destructive judges, they hurt all of us. And while the deluge of bad news from Judge Flood may be drying up right now, we still have plenty of flood risk elsewhere in our judiciary, even if they are not as obvious as this current tsunami of incompetence was out in Bremerton. Now, finally, I want to close this video with just a few suggestions for those of you who want to actually make a difference in your community. This is a good example. Start by just documenting the problems that you're witnessing from local judges where you actually live. Are they stealing money? Do they just suck at their jobs? Are they good at putting on a show, but when given a chance, do they regularly fail to protect and uphold the Constitution when the opportunity presents itself in the courtroom? Do they consistently release violent criminals early just to, in turn, hurt more people in your community? Do you even know how bad or competent that your local judges are right now today? Obviously, our state Supreme Court has no clue, and neither does the Democratic Party, but does anyone else? Starting down this road to kind of observe your judges in action, that might be a good place to stop the flood of progress. And I've sat actually in the back of courtrooms for many days before, just kind of watching how judges process and handle cases and how they rule in the more interesting and controversial ones. This is actually something that I think we all must start doing so that we can identify those who just need to be replaced. And especially in our state, we at least have the option to vote out the bad ones. And like everything else in our community, most long-term change, it ends up starting locally. And it probably starts with you and me. We don't need more judge floods submerging our communities and then causing us harm. But if we want to change things, we must show up. We can't just hope and pray that somebody else solves it for us. Nobody's coming to help. We must help ourselves, I believe, and of course, educating ourselves first is probably a good initial step. Because remember, as I always say, the future belongs to those who show up.